Welcome again to everyone who's just joining us to this webinar on future trends in early childhood development in a changing development sector landscape, hosted by Oxford Policy Management. If you're just joining us, please put your name and organization in the chat box so we can familiarize ourselves with all the participants. My name is Anuradha and I lead the Global Early Childhood Development team at OPM. We're very happy to have you join us today for this discussion. Just in terms of the session format, I'm going to very briefly share OPM's experience and lessons working in ECD. But the majority of the focus of this webinar is going to be this panel discussion that we have for you today. If you do have any questions during the discussion, please feel free to put them in the chat box. Next slide, please. Just to very briefly begin, we wanted to shape what ECD means to us here at OPM. We focus on the 0 to 8 age group with an emphasis on holistic development of young children working across multiple sectors and domains. OPM's multiple practices have in-house expertise, and so our view of early childhood development includes early childhood development systems, early learning, and foundational learning, as well as health, nutrition, and WASH. And so we take quite a cross-cutting view of ECD. Next slide, please. Our work spans multiple geographies. We've worked in 15 countries, primarily in Africa and South Asia, and we've worked with foundations, governments, multilaterals, bilaterals, and several other development partners. We believe in working very closely and in collaboration with our partners, and none of our outputs and our work together would be possible without these partners. Next slide, please. Given the focus of holistic development for young children in our work, thematically, our projects span across various domains of the nurturing care framework. For example, in the areas of good health and adequate nutrition, we've done projects in India in improving maternal and child health and nutrition to evaluate program effectiveness. In terms of early learning opportunities, we've studied the feasibility of public-private partnerships in Serbia. And in terms of responsive caregiving, we focused on understanding parenting practices in Indonesia, just as a few examples of our work. Next slide, please. Given the breadth of these thematic areas and geographies, we've tried to reflect on a few select key findings in each of the countries that we've worked in, or a sample of the countries that we've worked in. These findings echo what we have seen in other research and evaluation programs across the world, and I'm sure this echoes with your work as well. For example, in India and in Zimbabwe, health and nutrition programs have improved service quality, we found, but they've struggled with systemic constraints such as workload pressures and resource limitations. We found that a more holistic approach is needed. In a project in Liberia, we found that structured support improves curriculum adoption through primary school transitions, though external disruptions like COVID-19 hinder sustained impact. Our research in Indonesia shows that traditional childcare knowledge dominates, excluding fathers from parenting interventions, something that we've seen in several other countries as well. And we feel that future programs must target inclusive caregiving approaches. In Nigeria and in India, we found that cash transfer programs improve child nutrition and maternal health and early childhood development outcomes. Behavioral interventions must accompany financial support to maximize the impact of these programs. And finally, in Tanzania, we've seen that while considerable resource has been allocated to ECD, there's a need for increased transparency in budget allocation and systemic expenditure tracking to enhance accountability and efficiency. Next slide, please. Finally, just in line with the theme for today's panel discussion, we believe that focusing on specific areas within ECD that requires attention, given the current changes in the funding landscape globally, will be important to ensure that the spotlight on ECD continues. First, we believe that focusing on low-cost, high-impact, proven interventions and leveraging systems will be important. Given multiple funding shifts in the development sector, focusing on interventions that are easy to adopt, that are affordable and high impact will be critical. We believe that country-level agendas are of priority. the impact of changing funding across the globe means that every country will have to evaluate its own priorities and funding streams. We think there's a need to advocate for a focus on spending on ECD. Every subdomain of education, health, and development will have competing priorities in terms of resources. A sharp and persistent advocacy for ECD will be imperative. And finally, we think it'll be important to explore innovative financing mechanisms for ECD that focus on results and that can maximize impacts in terms of funding streams. Next slide, please. To learn more about our projects and early childhood development, please feel free to visit the ECD page on our website. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Sauravi for our panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for that overview of OPM's work in ECD, Anuradha. Hi, everyone. My name is Sauravi, and I lead the Education, ECD, and Skills practice at OPM, and I'm delighted to be moderating this discussion today. First of all, welcome to everyone who's joined us online for this discussion. As the title suggests, we'll be talking today about future trends in ECD in a changing aid landscape. In light of significant recent reduction in development aid, today the main discussion, first and foremost, will be on what this means for children, families, and communities in individual countries. And our panelists will share their global, but more importantly, country-level perspectives on how these changes are likely to impact the ECD sector. So whoever you are, if you're an ECD practitioner, a researcher, or indeed in a government or funder organization, I do hope there'll be something for you in terms of insights and perspectives to take away from today. Just a quick round of introductions to our panelists. Dr. Manzoor Ahmed is the chair of the Bangladesh ECD network, as well as the founding director of the BRAC University's Institute of Educational Development. Dr. Ahmed has served for over 2 decades in senior positions on ECD, both within and outside Bangladesh, especially as the UNICEF country director in China, Ethiopia, and Japan. Welcome, Dr. Ahmed. Dr. Kwabena Tando, till very recently, was the Deputy Director General for Quality and Access at the Ghana Education Service. I should also add that Dr. Tando's role and remit extended to early childhood education and readiness of young children to join primary school. So in that role, he also oversaw critical investments made by the Ghanaian Ministry of Education, impacting the provision and quality of kindergarten. So welcome, Dr. Tando. And last but not least, Professor Sally Brinkman is the co-director of the Fraser Mustard Centre and works at the University of South Australia. Sally has dedicated her entire career to measuring children's development outcomes, and we particularly value her expertise and pragmatism in ECD measurement tools that have been instrumental in understanding inequalities, as well as evaluating ways to improve children's learning and health. So welcome, Sally. Sally, while I have you, maybe we start with you first. So one country you have a long-standing professional relationship with is the Pacific small island country of Kiribati, a country highly susceptible to climate change and rising sea levels. And more importantly, in the context of today's discussion, one of the most aid-dependent countries in the world as well. So what is likely to be the impact of recent shifts and reduction in overseas development aid on children, families, and communities that you have worked with?
Thanks, Saru. I just apologize for the weird background. Kiribati is also in a power blackout at the moment, so I'm running on my laptop and my phone, so please forgive me for that. So it's interesting. Kiribati is a country in the middle of the Pacific. It's a very small country, and so yes, extremely dependent on aid. And it's a small island state, so 23 islands spread across an extremely large area, so very expensive area also to implement any services. So there's some complexities that are specific to small island states, I think that Kiribati definitely suffers with. In terms of the current situation of, in regards to aid, being very, very dependent on other countries means it's extremely susceptible to these shifts. And so far, it's a little hard to tell exactly on a day-to-day basis how much of an impact it's going to have. The country is very much going through all of its programs and working out who funds what. We are definitely worried from a indicator point of view, that's for sure, because USAID in particular funds a lot of programs. For example, the DHS survey, which we understand is now being on hold. Many countries and many organizations are dependent on that as a data source. And I understand even the historic data has been recently taken down from the websites, which makes it extremely difficult for countries to be able to monitor how well they're doing, what shifts may be occurring over time, where they may be making improvements or where they're not. And I think, as in the introduction, this means that countries are really going to have to pick up themselves and be able to implement monitoring strategies across their own country and have their own sort of independent capacity to be able to understand what's working well and what's not working well for the children in their countries. This is something that I think we've all been working to try and build capacity in countries, but I suppose there has been a dependency. So I think, low-cost solutions that are relatively easy to implement, that don't require, a whole lot of specialized consultants coming in to support the process, I think is going to be an increasing trend if we're going to sort of see the indicator movement moving forward. So I know many agencies are getting quite worried about that, and in countries we're definitely getting worried about that as well, in terms of trying to work out what's worth investing in and what's not worth investing in. You need to be able to evaluate, which means you need solid indicators to be able to do that. So.
Perfect. Thanks, Sally. So too early to tell, probably, how it impacts children at a direct level, but already signs of massive shifts, such as the DHS survey disappearing, but also the historic data disappearing. Thanks so much, Sally. Dr. Ahmed, I'll ask you the same question. So with donor funds becoming ever more scarce, as we just heard, what's likely to be the impact of these reductions on the ECD sector in Bangladesh? And thinking from the viewpoint of disadvantage and marginalization, do you think there are some groups that might bear the brunt of this the most? You're on mute, Dr. Ahmed. Dr. Ahmed, we'll give you a minute to unmute. It's a very common issue with Teams, don't worry. But in the meantime, I might direct the question to Dr. Tando. So let's move to Ghana, and then we'll come back to Bangladesh. Dr. Tando, you have worked within the Ghanaian Ministry of Education on large donor-funded programs. So when aid stops or reduces substantially, and sometimes overnight, as we've seen recently, from your experience in government, how does a Deputy Director of Ghanaian Education Service respond in the immediate aftermath and then in the medium and long term?
Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to join this panel and to share some insights into what is happening in Ghana, as well as to discuss the future of ECD, especially in light of some of the challenges that we seem to be having in the donor community when it comes to aid. Ghana specifically, as you've mentioned, we have been the beneficiary of very large donor-funded projects in both ECD and ECE as well. More recently, especially with USAID, Ghana benefited from about a 9-year program in the USAID Learning Project, which really focused on literacy and numeracy competencies at a very early age. And, you know, such large donor-funded projects, both in ECD, in education, in health, and other related areas, really contribute to either piloting innovative strategies or even scaling up, you know, very sustainable strategies. But there are times, as you mentioned, where these challenges happen, and it's inevitable that you may have challenges with aid either stopping or reducing drastically, and sometimes overnight, as you referenced with the recent happenings with the USAID. But realistically, one of the things that, as either Deputy Director General or Director General of the Ghana Education Service responsible for implementing pre-tertiary education policy, I think one of the key things that you always need to be doing is to be thinking through and strategizing. You don't wait for aid to stop in order to figure out what to do. I'll share with you some of the benefits of what has helped in Ghana. Number one, we have had the advantage of really embedding and really integrating projects and programs into our existing structures. And so we see a situation where you have a lot more understanding, and you have a lot more of the implementation strategy happening with the staff of the Ghana Education Service, our teachers, our directors, our head teachers. And so the core in terms of knowledge transfer happens. And when those things happen, one of the first things you'd realize is that you rely less and less on external support, whether it is technical support or it is financial support, because once you have programs that are embedded, or once you have programs that are fully integrated into your structures, then those key funding lines begin to be absorbed by the regular government budget. And so that has been one of the key benefits for us in Ghana. However, as Deputy Director General or Director General of the Ghana Education Service, there are some key strategies and key sustainability strategies that should always be in your foremind. One of the key ones is, how do you push your programs in such a way that there is large government ownership and then there is gradual budget integration to absorb any eventualities? Number two, how do you ensure that you have very strong community involvement and other strategies for resource mobilization? So while the aid may come to begin a program and to really jumpstart a particular intervention, you need to constantly be looking at how do you involve the community for community buy-in, community involvement, and also look at other forms of resource mobilization to support the interventions that you're doing. Then what I began with is, I think it is also important that you look at capacity building and knowledge transfer. Some of these big, large programs would come with very sophisticated, high-level technical assistance. And so one of the things is, once you have an embedded strategy, then you allow for knowledge transfer and capacity building of your existing local staff. When that happens, then it becomes a shock absorber to any potential aid cut or reduction in aid. Then I think it is also absolutely critical that you leverage data-driven decision making, so that even in scale, you may want want to look at what the data is saying, so you don't do a blanket scale to the whole country. It may be something that is going to be more beneficial to rural communities. And so once you rely heavily on good analyzed data, then you're able to make better interventions and better targeted laser-focused intervention. So data-driven decision-making is also very critical. Then the last two key things, one is to look at strategic partnerships. So you have a program or an intervention that you're doing, say, with FCDO. Once you're doing such programs with, say, FCDO, you look at what other strategic partnerships can you form that really support the key things that you are doing. A key example of that is Ghana just ran through a really strong FCDO-funded project called CBE, or Complementary Basic Education. It did really well in getting out-of-school children into school. But we realized that one of the key things we needed to do was to integrate that to an agency within government, so that once FCDO funding tapers off, you have embedded it, you have established that strategic partnership to make sure that there is a continuity in terms of the impact of that aid. Then the last thing is actually looking at a phased approach in your transition. So you may be doing something that really makes sense, and it really supports a lot of the work you're doing. But when it comes to transitioning it into government takeover, you look at a phased approach. We are doing a project which is we're doing a project with Lively Minds, where we started very small in just a few districts, and we are scaling up to about 60 districts. But the transition where we go to what we call a sustained approach is a transitional process. So these are some of the key things that, as Deputy Director General, as Director General, you have to constantly be thinking through to make sure that you have sustainable strategies to absorb any eventuality in donor or aid shift, especially in these uncertain times. Thank you.
Perfect, Dr. Tanda. Thank you so much. There's so much rich information there that you shared. But I think the thing that stuck with me is this transition cannot happen overnight. There's very long-term planning that's required, as you said, towards government ownership as well as budget integration and community buy-in. Thank you. I believe, Dr. Manzoor, your sound is working now, so that's made my day. I'll ask you so let's return to Bangladesh then. So what, in your view, might be the impact of this recent reduction in aid on the ECD sector in Bangladesh? And particularly, I was asking whether there might be some groups or subpopulations that will probably bear the brunt of this reduction the most.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very sorry. You can hear me now, but getting any, I don't know.
We can hear you very clearly. Yes.
Yes, but I'm getting an echo. So what should I? Can you do something from your end? I don't know.
It's very likely because you're connected through two devices. But just to say, all of us here can hear you very clearly and see you as well.
Okay. Live with echo. Anyway, the point is that we're living in very difficult times right now, globally and in the country. Globally, of course, I mean, you have mentioned the situation regarding external support for the countries. Now, you have a situation where in the most important country regarding external support, the United States, the words diversity, equality, equity, or inclusion are dirty words. And these are basic principles of programming in any kind of social development, including childhood development, diversity, and these are officially, legally dirty words. These are being tried to be banned from any programming. And we see the reflection of that in trying to dismantle USAID. And we see, well, not quite something similar, but also FCDO also in difficult situation because their limited resources are being diverted to other challenges, maybe like Ukraine war. So this is difficult internationally, politically, and within countries, well, particularly in Bangladesh, we have had now that recent political change, which we hope open up new opportunities because we have a very well-respected international person as the head of the interim government, Dr. Yunus, and the advisory council who are good people and to do well for the people, and many have been our friends and colleagues, our, has developed activities. But then, what the legacy that we've been living with in terms of government policies and government operations, certain things like early child development has not been a priority of government. We have had policy adopted, like in 2013, more than 12 years ago, we had a comprehensive early childhood development policy, which was adopted by the government because of lobbying advocacy of the civil society organizations like, of course, the Bangladeshi network and so on. But then the right step or right, follow has not been happening to implement it. The rhetoric is there, but actually, in terms of adopting programs and strategies to bring all children into some kind of basic service for young children, that is not. So as a result, we have maybe 15% or so children, say from prenatal age, are in some kind of organized early childhood development activity, and the others mostly left. So this is something that a political choice that the government, that the nation is to make, and it cannot just depend on external assistance. So we have had some external support, and we have tried, the NGO as organizations tried to carry on some activities, and we have also engaged in advocacy and policy development. And that has resulted in the adoption of the policy and some of these activities and some specific government activities. Well, there are, segmented kind of services, like have the health services like immunization program, maternity, maternal health programs. You have some nutrition activities. You have some protection activities. But these have not all come together as a holistic, comprehensive program to help the young children. So the policy clearly states what has to be done, what has to be the objective, and what the strategy is, how different agencies, government, and civil society must work together. But then having a policy obviously is not enough. You have to have some action program, strategies, the actors to be identified, and then they have together, and there have to be champion in the government and the civil society carry these out. And in that respect, we have not had enough success. I think we have achieved something, but not enough. And then with this new government, we had hoped that it would create a new opportunity. But then the actors are still the same. in the government, in different ministries and so on. And the commitment and dedication and the full understanding of a comprehensive, dedicated policy that is still not. So we remain, in this struggle, this challenge, and of course the international assistance crying out now, that's not going to happen. So I think we have to see in the future, how do we become more self-reliant and then engage a policy discourse so that the early childhood development becomes a political agenda, a political priority. So the government and the political parties, decision making, give more attention. So that's where we are, and that's the challenge we have. And I think this is similar to maybe what the countries also face. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. And just for colleagues who may have struggled with the sound a little bit, I'll just very quickly summarize, because there was a lot of very rich information there that when Dr. Ahmed was speaking. I think primarily, Dr. Ahmed, what you were saying is that certain fundamental ingredients that you need for holistic ECD service delivery is lacking at the moment in the context that you were talking about. So, for instance, the policies are there, but the implementation is quite weak. Only 15% of children from 0 to 8 years are in some kind of organized ECD service delivery. And so the external aid that comes through various donors can probably contribute a bit, but unless those foundational elements of the system are not put in place, it's quite hard to see what difference this reduction will make. And it's really the foremost and the first order priority here is towards self-reliance, with the external aid making its contribution in that space. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed. I hope I did a bit of justice to summarizing what you tried to say. I should add that before we go to the next block of questions, I'll invite everyone who's on the call to put your questions and comments in the chat. We will pick a few, as many as we can in the time available, and pose them to our panelists. So thank you everyone for already putting some questions and comments in the chat. So let's sort of move on a little bit. We've seen that there will be varying degrees of impact of these aid reductions, depending on how aid dependent the country was already, and also what kind of existing systems around budget integration and government ownership there already was. So shifting gears a little bit, and again, maybe looking at you, Sally, first. This is about the response now, and you've already started alluding to it. You mentioned about the DHS and what that implies. So with increasingly scarce donor funds, which now need to be spent more effectively, and also very critical domestic resources, as in the case of Kiribati, as you mentioned, we do need to understand what the most evidence-based solutions are. There will no doubt be more focus on low-cost, high-impact, proven interventions, and to leverage existing systems, as Anuradha mentioned. And this will need very strong measurement, assessment, research tools, capabilities, and such. How do we ensure that these measurements and tools are globally comparable and meaningful, and also accessible to everyone in the current context?
Thanks. Yeah, so I mean, I think in the last 10 years or so, there actually has been a lot of great different initiatives internationally around in the measurement space. I mean, if we go back 20 years, most of the instruments in early child development very much came out of pediatrics only, and some through psychology. And many of them were licensed by publishers or universities, and the complicated agreements to be able to use the instruments. data sovereignty back to the countries, was always a bit of an issue. So reducing countries' ability to be able to take on the instruments themselves and really embed them into their own systems. I think, the situation has moved on quite a lot. So we're seeing increasingly instruments that are available that are free, that are easily adaptable to culture and context, but still are able to provide some international comparison as well as. And I think this idea of either it's an international comparative measure or, for global comparison, or it's an instrument that is locally relevant and not globally comparative is, I don't think we need to create that sort of, either or situation. It can be both. So I think we can, use the international instruments, but adapt them, add to them so that we're adding locally, culturally relevant information to them, so that we're getting the information that is locally relevant, and that countries and governments in particular engage in that instrumentation. I think just having international league tables is not enough. You want to have instruments that are going to provide information at the local level, and ideally data that communities can engage with so they can understand where their children are at and how they can better support their children, right from the local community level through to the maybe jurisdictional governments and then the national governments. And of course, there'll always be, a place for the international comparison as well. One of the advantages, of course, of the international comparative instruments is that they generally have reliability and validity behind them. They've been tested. And so then when going into a new country, clearly you still need to be able to do that, but you can be relatively confident that the instruments are going to work. So I think the time is right. I mean, some key ones that I would mention are clearly recently the World Health Organization's Global Scale for Early Development, the GSED. There are, in terms of measuring child development for 0 to 3, for above 3, there are other instruments, both direct assessments as well as teacher or parent reported instruments like the Early Human Capability Index, or there's the MELCO instrumentation. There's quite a few out there. Save the Children has the IDELA instrument. These are probably ones that many of the people online would be familiar with. And I think the scope and scale of implementing those instruments is increasing. And I think as more people use those, then the capacity building and the capacity opportunities are actually not held with one group, they're actually shared. And then we're seeing that communities of practice can start up across multiple countries and regions and even across jurisdictions. And we found that can be quite helpful in terms of countries adopting the monitoring agendas themselves, if they can see that there's engagement and they can see the utility of the data back down to the community level. So I think the time, it's a good time in the measurement space. I feel that things have definitely moved on. There are options available, and lots of different options, increasing options for countries to be able to pick up. The challenge is, in tough times, people will tend to prioritize high-level targeting. And rightly so, I get that. You target the most vulnerable when you've got the smaller amounts of money. But I think coming from a public health approach, it's really important to still see a very strong universal base of services. Otherwise, it's very difficult to know where to target. And that universal base will come from both, large-scale surveillance and monitoring systems through things like universal community child health nurses or universal preschool, those sorts of system-wide stable service provision really provides the foundation for better targeting. And without those sorts of initiatives, I think the targeted services can be and not necessarily are we right, targeting the right populations. And so that's where if we're going to cut back on things, clearly I'm an advocate of measuring, but I think there's a real risk that people see that as a second tier thing rather than as something that should really be up front in terms of being able to inform and then monitor how we're doing on the small monies that we do have that tend to be dedicated to the 0 to 5 age range in particular, and probably that sort of 1 to 3 year age range is the one that we really see a weakness across many countries.
Perfect. Thank you, Sally. As always, a lot of very deep insights. So if you're a donor listening to this conversation, one very important contribution you could make is to support free open access existing tools, ones that have been validated and tested in a number of contexts. A couple of examples that you gave, Sally, were the GSED tool from WHO and IDELA from Save the Children. And also a very fair warning to not fall into the false dichotomy of international or local tools. International tools can definitely be piloted and adapted to be used to inform local context. Thank you so much. Dr. Tandwal, I'll shift to you now. And this question is, again, I think drawing on your experience of working in government. So in the midst of so many competing priorities, when funds are so limited, often ECD goes underfunded. We heard that already from Dr. Ahmed. You will have seen that with pre-primary education funding, for instance, it often gets really shoved to the corner. What are some effective ways to advocate for focus and spending on ECD in these circumstances, both with funders but also within your own government, with the Ministry of Finance, for example? How do you take that advocacy message to these stakeholder groups?
Well, thank you. It's clear that all over the world, actually, not just in developing countries, but all over the world, whenever there is a funding crunch, you'd see that ECD may fall off, the priority of things to fund, and it's usually the hard choices that governments and organizations make. But I think that one of the key strategies as a leader of an implementing agency focusing on early childhood development or early childhood education, the number one thing you need to be able to do is to learn to the balancing act of politics and policy. And so you need to be able to really understand who is the holder of the funding purse, and how do you make sure that you use a lot more diplomacy, a lot more tactfulness, and strategic politics to make sure that you are advocating for funding and resources to support ECD. So it is really critical that as an educational leader who is implementing, or any leader who is focused on ECD, that you understand the balancing act of politics and policy. Number two, I think it is important that you present or position ECD as an economic return investment. And so you need to be able to make sure that you are not just discussing ECD in isolation or in a silo, but rather looking at it, especially if you're talking to Ministry of Finance or the Minister of Finance, that you are looking at it as an economic return investment, and you focus on the human capital index and the importance of measuring that human capital index from what happens in the 0 to 8 and the type of preparation that you give to children. So I think that's also very critical. Then, of course, it's important to emphasize the social impact of ECD in terms of how it supports social cohesion and then growth in general. Then again, we would go back to, I think Prof. Sally mentioned this, but it's important to really understand the use of data and evidence in presenting your case. So if you just go to your Minister of Finance or the holder of the funding purse and you just say, I need resources to go to ECD, of course, health need resources, defense needs resources, all of these other areas needs resources. But I think it is important that you go with data and with evidence. Verifiable evidence and data becomes the name of the game, so that you are able to back your request with concrete evidence and data. It's absolutely critical. Then usually it is also important to push ECD formulations, policies, and everything within national development plans, so that when you are making such requests for prioritized funding for ECD, that you can refer to a national agenda and how that ECD is a major pillar of that national agenda. So the work begins in development plans and all of the things that must be done. And then, it is also important to frame ECD as a national investment rather than investment in just children, because the decision makers forget that they were also in that age group before they moved up. So I think once you look at it in a long-term strategy as a national investment, those things become very critical in ensuring that even in very difficult environments, that you get some resources or some needed resources channeled to ECD. Then the last key thing I'll talk about again is building strong partnerships and coalitions, so that it becomes a combined effort and you form strong alliances from all different avenues to advocate for funding, especially within the government space. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tando. I could not agree more. And in fact, as you were speaking, there were messages in the chat agreeing and echoing what you're saying. I think the point about us needing to be much more skilled in messaging about the connections between ECD and the economy, ECD and growth, ECD and its social impact, being able to balance, as you said, politics and policy, and being able to package the evidence within that, but not get so tied up with the evidence that we forget that there are wider priorities that the Ministry of Finance in a particular country is also fighting the corners of. And of course, as you said, integrating ECD within the national development plan, within the national development vision of a country, means that it doesn't get seen as a side project, as an extracurricular. And of course, building those partnerships and coalitions. Thank you very much, Dr. Tando. Let's see if Dr. Ahmed, your sound is working now. I have a question actually very related to what Dr. Tando was saying, and this is around alliances within a country, national alliances. So you have decades of experience in ECD, and so will probably have seen these kinds of shifts in funding over the years. So Bangladesh Education ECD network, rather, that you are the chairperson of, is an alliance of over 900 ECD-focused organizations. What role do you think a national alliance like that should play in moments like these? Oh dear, looks like Dr. Ahmed's sound is still off. Okay, while he sorts out the sound, what I'll do is go to a few of the questions that have been coming on the chat. So Sally, a question for you, a couple of questions for you, in fact. Great point on universal support, and Australia does a great job with its ECD census. Can the small monies we have now left be leveraged to attract more capital? Other innovative funding mechanisms from private or philanthropies on evidence, and if so, how? Give us all the answers.
It's easy. No, I mean, I think Raising Australia is a good example. I mean, I know it's not a low middle income country, that's for sure, but having the full census of child development, meaning that we're capturing every single child across the whole country in Australia, and it's geographically mapped and presented back to communities, is undertaken once every 3 years. We are using the same methodology of this census approach in some of the Pacific countries. Indeed, Kiribati, we have just completed the second round of using the same method of a census approach for 3 to 5 year olds and feeding that information back to community. And what we find is using the data in this way, by presenting data back to community, it gets a lot more traction than what you would normally get if you had either a survey sample and or a situation where you might have a government department who is monitoring something, but that data is not publicly shared and definitely not shared to the community. I think then the onus of responsibility then goes back on that individual department that's collecting that information. And as we know, early child development falls through the gaps as such. And those of us in ECD, we all complain about that, right? Because it sort of sits in between and no one agency is responsible. I think a way of turning that on its head a little bit is by, if we can provide data to everybody, to the public, it means that we can actually try and leverage funds from multiple departments, multiple agencies, philanthropists, non-governments, etc. Because you're creating an evidence base, you're able to very, very clearly identify communities and regions which need greater support. It becomes an extremely strong evidence base to be able to advocate for. And when you put the data back in the community's hands, it's amazing how much traction you get. Indeed, I'm in Kiribati at the moment, and we're presenting sort of mapped results back to all of the different government departments here, and it's been really interesting seeing the engagement from Department of Agriculture, Department of Health, Department of Education, Ministries of Social Protection, the police, etc., all engaging around the data. But we have to present here in Kiribati, if we're going to present any data to communities, you have to go through the National Research Committee, which sits underneath the Office of the President. And so now we've been asked to put a cabinet paper out. I think very rarely when we do data collections do we get requested to put cabinet papers up. I've worked in multiple countries now, and these census approaches, when you're telling the government that you're going to give the data back to community, suddenly the politicians actually do want to know. So I think there's some very strategic things that we can do when we're thinking about monitoring in early child development that can try and not have all eggs in one basket, right? That can try and sort of open, if we liberate data, we can try and then also broaden the scope for other agencies to engage in the same, with the same intent to enhance holistic early child development. So, and it gives other agencies the opportunities to do that. So I'm, clearly a strong advocate for it, but I think my advocacy really stems from understanding the traction that we're getting. And when I think about when I first started in this area, we didn't used to get that much traction by using different methodologies. So, yeah. Anyway.
Thanks, Sally. What a strong point you've made about bottom-up accountability and the need for engaging communities and and citizens in that process. I'm thinking a little bit about the citizen-led monitoring that happens in various sectors, such as health and education, and has led to a lot of traction around issues of low foundational learning, for instance. And probably something similar in the ECD sector is needed to draw attention to it as an important element in any development dialogue. We only have a minute left, so I'm just going to very quickly say thank yous to everyone. Really appreciate your time and for struggling and fighting through various technological issues in Bangladesh and Kiribati with the blackout. And Dr. Tanda, thank you so much for sharing all your insights. So I think we've heard a lot about the shifting aid paradigm and how seismic and important these shifts are. And I will not try to summarize the rich discussion because it had so many important insights. But I think something that stuck with me is to never waste a good crisis. And I think our panelists have shown us today that we have an opportunity here for integration of ECD into the national development dialogue in any country. We have the opportunity here for bringing in the remaining donor funding and making it a lot more impactful than it probably was before, even if the volumes were more. And we have an opportunity here for much better, sharper messaging that involves ECD within the core politics and policy of any country. So thank you very much. I hope you were able to engage, ask questions, put your comments, and gain from all these diverse perspectives. Thank you for your time and hope to see you all again. Thank you.